There are plenty of basic tips on how to play the opening, control the center, develop your pieces, castle, and there are also universal tips on how to play the middle game and end game. But today, we're going to go deeper and touch on an idea that many amateurs never reach or even think about. I'll do my best to explain everything to you in the simplest terms possible so you can come out of tough situations as the winner. Let's get started. Today we'll talk about dynamic and static imbalances in positions, and by breaking things down step by step, we'll learn how to act correctly. So only those who watch until the end will understand. Let's go step by step. What is dynamics? Dynamics is what matters to us right here and now, and statics is what will remain for a long time to come. In one way or another, unless the position is some kind of... But with an absolutely equal position, one of the players will have a greater dynamic or, on the contrary, static advantage, and by understanding this, we can choose our next actions, what to do next. Dynamics includes the king's position, piece activity, and initiative, meaning things we can use right now. Statics includes material, we compare pawn structure, the presence of certain weaknesses that can't be quickly eliminated. Control of space and control of files and diagonals. Take a look at this position. How would you like to play here right now? White has a position with an isolated pawn. For example, if we don't know the main plans when playing with an isolated pawn, basically the pawn on d4 is a static weakness for us. If we don't get rid of it, it will remain there for a long time, and black will keep putting pressure on it. So we need to act dynamically, otherwise, what do we have here? If we do not have an attack on the king, since the king's positions are about equal, the activity of the pieces is also roughly the same. All our pieces seem to be placed well, but so are black's, except maybe the rook on e8 has not come out yet. There is no clear initiative at the moment, so we need to find it somewhere. In terms of pawn structure, the advantage is basically on black's side. Material is equal. As for control of files or space, I cannot say that anyone is clearly better here. But if, for example, we are statically worse, then we need to look for dynamic play. That means we either have to attack the king, blow up the position somehow, make our pieces suddenly active, and develop the initiative. And on the other hand, if our static position is good but our dynamics are lacking and the opponent is putting pressure on us, then it's the opposite. And this is what we are learning. What options do we have? Of course, we could simply, for example, exchange on d5 and get some kind of endgame that would be roughly equal, but here white isn't fighting for an advantage because black also has chances to invade on c2. In terms of dynamic advantages, maybe we only have the two bishops, but we shouldn't cling to the two bishops here. When playing with an isolated pawn, we either try to use the activity of our pieces to launch a kingside attack, or we try to get rid of the isolani. There's no talk of a kingside attack here, so we need to look for a way to blow up the position as soon as possible to push this pawn to d5. What do we need to do for that? Here, white finds the move bishop to f6 because bishop f6 forces black to return the knight to f6. Otherwise, after bishop f6, we have three attackers on d5 and black only has two defenders. The knight returns to f6 and we push d5. And after e takes d5, now pay close attention and pause the video and answer the question with what? You need to capture the pawn on d5. In the game, white took it with the knight, which is not the most accurate decision. It might be more human, meaning you just want to grab it with the knight right away, but after that, the position unfortunately simplifies. That is, if you take with the rook, you create a threat, and you could also have taken with the bishop, which probably would have been better. But the problem is that the move bishop to e7 is not a threat because the queen will capture, and on b7, you could probably just put a pawn on b6. Actually, no, you can't put a pawn on b6, pardon me, because then there would be bishop b7. So you just move the rook somewhere to c7, and the position is roughly equal here. White can't really take advantage of the fact that the rook is opposite the queen, so that doesn't work. But if you take with the bishop, it's a completely different story because now the pawn on b7 is hanging. For example, if you play rook c7 and still, let's go back to why in that situation you can't take the pawn on b7. Let's compare again, or rather you can take it, but then black plays queen b5, attacking the bishop and the b2 pawn in response. So black easily regains the material here. In this position, after bishop d5, if you play rook c7, as I said, it's about equal. And after rook e8, you can also exchange and take on e7 with the bishop, and there won't be any quick recapture of the pawn. taking on d5 with the knight actually loses immediately, because now after white has opened up the position and gotten rid of their static weaknesses, it's clear that white's pieces are much better placed than black's. They managed to use the dynamics because the rooks are active. The knight wants to go to a7, threatening a fork, and there are also threats to the queen. And knight f6 is coming. It's extremely hard to defend against everything at once. So you shouldn't take on d5. If you make any move, for example, rook b8, then the bishop retreats to b3, opening up the rook, and the bishop works along this diagonal. If queen c6, for example, you exchange, and that's probably one of the best things black can do here. White's position is more pleasant. It's still far from one, but I think there are no questions about who is better. If the queen moves somewhere to c7, then knight b5, and we start putting pressure on the opponent on the b6 square, and the d6 point is hanging, and soon the pawn on a7 will be under attack with further invasions by the rooks. Looking at the second position, I think you start to feel for black. Their situation is really bad. The queenside pawns are weak, their pawn structure is suffering, the dark squared bishop doesn't feel great, and the light squared one isn't enviable either. It has no prospects right now. So there's no talk of dynamics because you can't attack the king, and there's no piece activity either. What activity do black's pieces have here? There's no initiative, and white, on the other hand, has an ideal pawn structure and should focus on the c5 pawn. With queen f2 and knight f4, their play is pretty straightforward. If you remove all the heavy pieces from the board, white will have a simply winning position. So if you realize that you are statically in a really bad spot, you need to really urgently look for a way to complicate the situation, maybe sacrifice something somewhere for the initiative just to try to keep fighting. Otherwise, your opponent will just roll over you. Black should play rook d4 here. Put the rook on an outpost right under the bishop, directly attacking the bishop. If white doesn't react in any way, that's probably the best thing they can do. For example, if they play something like knight f4, then you can push h5 on the king side and bring the rook to d8. The main thing is that we've blocked the c5 pawn, sacrificing the exchange. If they accept the sacrifice and take with the c pawn after knight f4, we put the bishop on d6. If the opponent tries to play c5, our light squared bishop comes to life and might even support the pawn in the future. And if they transfer the knight to d3, we put a pawn on c5, forming a little triangle. The fact that white has an extra exchange right now doesn't really matter at all, since there are no open files on the board, and black can, for example, transfer the king somewhere and keep pushing the h-pawn. Of course, it's clear that the advantage remains with white. No one is arguing that. They have an extra exchange and black doesn't have a direct attack. But this is a chance to stay in the game, keep fighting, and create some problems for the opponent, putting them in an uncomfortable situation where they also have to figure things out, instead of just going with the flow and waiting for the opponent to steamroll them. Let's move on. But when you, my friends, feel that your opponent has a dynamic advantage and serious initiative, you need to do everything you can to neutralize it and steer the game into simpler waters. Take a look at this position. White has a whole extra rook, but let's be honest, it's for 2 pawns. What happens if we try to save this rook at all costs right now? So our king is worse, right? The activity of our pieces is probably worse too. And the initiative is not on our side. So in terms of dynamic factors, we're completely losing, but we have plenty of material, and that's the most important thing. So what happens if we try to keep the rook? For example, let's move the bishop to d4 now. Then black will take on f4 with the knight. For example, we might play bishop to c5 to set up a discovered attack, and then comes queen to g5. And suddenly, in just a couple of moves, black gets to our king. And if we play queen to g3, we jump right into a fork on e2, even if we don't waste time on bishop to c5. So what should we do? Queen e5 is basically an inevitable threat now, and even king f1 doesn't help. There's bishop b5, so things are bad for white. That's why we urgently need to simplify the position and give up some material. But the main thing is to neutralize black's initiative. So we should take the rook on d3. You don't need that extra rook. Take, rook f4, and bring the queen back to defend. That's it. The initiative is gone. Now we bring the rook over. We still have an extra piece for 2 pawns, but we've repelled the attack. And now we'll work on converting this position. For example, maybe queen f7, bishop c1, we can transfer the bishop to a3, or even take on h6 or bring out the rook. There are plenty of resources, but the main thing is we've dealt with our problems. Let's move on. And now, as a little treat, here's an example from my own games, actually. Looking at the position again, by the way, we see an isolated pawn. And I think after 3 examples, it's clear that right now the dynamic advantage is on black's side. Their pieces are more active. They're piling up pressure on the queen side, while I'm having problems with that. But on the other hand, my pawn structure is better, and my dark squared bishop is well placed. Still, it's important for me now to try to simplify the position to calm things down. And then I'll be able to try to use my static advantage here in the form of the pawn on d5. If I can suppress their initiative, then my position will be better. Let's watch, just observe and see what happens. Rook to d1, knight to c3. Black played, took, knight to d4. The knight occupies the blockade square. Queen to b6, queen to h5. It's important that, despite controlling the open file, black can't actually do anything on that open file. The queen moves to an active position, we improve our pieces, bishop to f5, exchanges of minor pieces. When your opponent has an isolated pawn, these exchanges are favorable. And again, every player who has taken a course on playing against isolated pawns knows this, as do those who study with me. And really, friends, it's important to know the main plans for playing against isolated pawns. Exchanges of minor pieces are in our favor. So if he doesn't take, then you can take on a 6 yourself and consider queen to g6. But after the exchange, it's obvious that the game has calmed down. One exchange of minor pieces, another exchange of minor pieces, and now the pawn on d5 becomes a target for attack. And just when black's dynamic play has fizzled out, it turns out that the pawn on d5 is a serious problem. For example, if you take on d4, rook takes d4, the pawn is simply lost. And that's what happened. The queen attacks again, another threat, and there are some one-move tricks. But after we've calmed everything down, we make a luff just in case. Now the knight goes to fe4, and black's hasty decision to exchange queens, thinking that the pawn on d5 is about to fall, unfortunately leads to the loss of the e4 pawn after the exchanges. And then the game transitions into a winning endgame, which of course still needs to be converted, but here it's not too difficult. To sum up, understanding that there is an imbalance on the board, either static or dynamic, you should try to tip the scales in your favor. If your static position is good, but your opponent has the initiative, dynamic play, you need to try to calm the position down as much as possible. And on the other hand, if you feel that you have a lot of weaknesses, that you are statically worse, look for an opportunity to blow up the position, maybe sacrifice something for the initiative and create problems for your opponent.